Thank you so much for your time. And for those of you that have just joined us, we are talking about Article 6. So we are the Article 16 from Middle Nation, and we are running a campaign which aims to address the persistent violations of the United Nations Charter by the United States of America. Now, we are calling for the expulsion of America from the United Nations because we want to end the imbalance and the misuse of power in the United Nations and then restore the organization's ability to promote global peace, security, and cooperation. So we want to empower individuals, in the quest for justice. We want to unite people and organizations to challenge the systems that currently uphold injustice and conflict worldwide. And that is through the corruption within the United Nations. So our campaign aims to gather widespread grassroots support. We want to educate the people about the detrimental impact that America's actions has had on international relations. We want to lobby member states to invoke Article 6 against the United States of America, and we want to highlight the misuse of the United States veto power. We want to advocate for a reformed and just United Nations. And in doing all of this, we want to ensure that the United Nations upholds and enforces its own charter that it signed in 1945. Our campaign is working towards holding America accountable. We want to see that justice prevails, and we want to see respect for international law, but not just international law. It also affects ordinary American citizens. So that means that the whole world is impacted. And by invoking Article 6, we are positive that it will have a positive impact on the world. So Brother Farouk, can you tell us, can you give us a little bit more in depth on what are the steps to invoke Article 6 at the United Nations?
So the steps to activate Article 6 are first to sign the petition. To sign the petition that we all have on our bios, on our website, and after that we must reach the goal of 100,000. And after that, once we reach the goal of 100,000 signatures on the website, we can approach several countries, several UN member states. There is a group of nations that is called the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. And those countries are one of the, some of the countries that have suffered thanks to the US's brutal actions throughout since just the foundation of the United Nations. And those countries, we can approach to them. Some of them are here on Latin America, so-called Latin America. Others are in Asia, and some of them in Africa. And those ones, we can reach those countries to propose the expulsion of the United States from the United Nations. So that will be the next step once we reach the goal of 100,000 signatures, to reach to those states, from the Group of Defense of Friends of the UN Charter. And after that, I want to let Brother Shahid to tell us what happens next. Or
Jazakallah khair, Brother Farouk.
Okay, go ahead, Brother Shahid. Thank you.
No, I was just going to say, as Brother Farouk said, the steps are quite straightforward. First, we want to get as many signatures as we can on the petition. It's a global petition, so it doesn't matter where you live, what country you're in, because no matter what country you're in, you do have a stake in this. And particularly, and we'll talk about that later, but particularly if you live in the United States, you actually have a significant stake in supporting this petition and supporting this measure, i.e. the expulsion of the United States from the United Nations. If you're an American citizen, you have a lot at stake here. and it's in your best interest to sign that petition. So obviously the case is that's going to be the case with anyone else around the world who is suffering from American imperialism and American domination and colonization and exploitation, violence and conflict that's spread by the United States. Almost anywhere else in the world, you also have a stake in this. So it's a global petition, and we're asking for as many people to sign it as possible. We're looking for a minimum of 100,000 signatures before we then take the petition and elevate it to the political and diplomatic level and approach member states of the UN, as Brother Farouk said, including the organization that's called the Friends of the United Nations in Defense of the UN Charter, which, as he said, it includes countries from across the world, from across Latin America, so-called Africa and Asia, including, I believe, Russia and China, where we can then approach these states at the political and diplomatic level to have them raise the issue at the United Nations, because it has to be done by a member state. It can't be done by an individual. It can technically be done by an NGO, but you can never really trust an NGO and where their funding comes from and so forth, and what their agendas might be and who's actually pulling the strings, particularly the purse strings of that NGO. So we want to go with a member state, and the member state will then raise it at the United Nations. It will then be voted upon by the Security Council and then sent to the General Assembly for a vote. And if there's a 2/3 majority in favor of invoking Article 6 against the United States, then, well, America would be expelled from the United Nations. And I don't think that I don't think that there's any question about whether or not you could get a 2/3 majority at the General Assembly. I think that if we were to hold a vote today, this afternoon or tomorrow, on whether or not the 193 countries in the General Assembly would like to see the United States expelled from the United Nations, I think you would see the closest thing ever to a unanimous vote of the General Assembly, where almost the entire global community would agree that that's something that needs to be done. So those are the steps. And as Brother Farouk said and Sister Nisa said, the beginning of that process is to sign the petition so that we can build the showing of global grassroots support for this measure that will then enable us to give confidence to the member states that we approach, to show them that we do have popular support for this measure. As I say, to give them the confidence to then raise it at the political level and raise it then officially at the United Nations.
Some people would say, why don't we just dissolve the United Nations and just start afresh somewhere else? We just don't believe that it is necessary to do that, because the United Nations Charter is a brilliant document. You know, the United States of America was one of the parties, one of the members that started the United Nations back in 1945, and they were signed that they would uphold peace and they would ensure that there's global peace and security. You know, all the promises made within the charter, they signed up for it. And like Brother Sheed always says, they put it in there, but they had absolutely no intention of upholding it. Now, our campaign, because we see that there is a shift towards the global south and America is being isolated and power is diminishing slowly but surely on the side of the United States of America, that we find that this campaign has come at the right time, where we will be able to invoke Article 6. We do believe that it will probably be highly successful, and it will take time. But with that said, it's not necessary to just dissolve the organization completely and just start afresh, because there are other organs within the organization that functions, like the ICJ, like the International Labour Organization, as well as the World Food Program, and all those other organs that's within the organization. Doesn't mean that there is one small corrupt entity within the organization, misusing and abusing its power and using it as a tool, that we need to throw everything out, because every other member state does perform or behave in a manner that is much more suited and less dominant than what America does. So Brother Shahid, can you perhaps, why do you think we really have an issue with the veto power, America's veto power, when it comes to Article 6, or why we want to invoke Article 6, and why problem, especially when it comes to Palestine?
First, I would like to actually just address first this idea about disbanding the United Nations. Everything that you said is perfectly correct and adequate. But I just wanted to add, why does it make sense to anyone to choose to disband the United Nations rather than hold America accountable? Because that's what you're saying. When you say, well, let's just disband the United Nations because it's not working, even though you know that the reason it's not working is because of American domination, now you're saying, well, let's just disband the United Nations rather than hold America accountable. How does that make more sense to you, morally? Not just morally, but practically. How does it make more sense that we will just forego the mechanism that's there for accountability for the United States? We'll just forego that, and we'll just disband the whole thing. How does that improve anything? How is that a solution in any way whatsoever? If you create an organization and it gets corrupted, and you know who corrupted it, if you're going to disband that organization and start another organization, and you've never dealt with the one who's corrupted the one in the past, you've never dealt with the one who has been breaking their promises, you never dealt with the one who undermined and sabotaged that organization in the first place, well, how are you going to guarantee that the new organization that you imagine you're going to build isn't going to be sabotaged as well? Because you've never put that corrupting power in check. If you decide if you advocate for disbanding the United Nations, then you are advocating for American unaccountability. And that's exactly the opposite of what we're doing. We're advocating for accountability. And not to mention the fact that you're trying to now create a much bigger problem and give yourself a much bigger challenge that you simply will not be able to do. When you take on a challenge, when you set yourself a goal that is practically unachievable, that's the same as surrender. That's the same as just self-defeat. You've just decided, I'm not going to do anything. Because what we have here in Article 6 is an actual existing legal mechanism for accountability. It's there. We don't have to come up with something. We don't have to come up with some new measure. We don't have to come up with some new law. We don't have to disband an organization and then come up with a new organization. We don't have to do any of that. So if you're not willing, if you're not ready, and you don't support actually just activating the mechanism of accountability that exists in the UN Charter, then you're just not someone who's serious about accountability in the first place. You're not someone who's serious about international law or the rule of law in the first place. And actually, you are, whether you know it or not, you're just advocating for and endorsing and supporting American hegemony and American unaccountability and American impunity. And you're actually just supporting and giving comfort to American colonization and imperialism. Now, with regards to the veto, I don't have the figures. I think Sister Nisa or Brother will have the figures, Brother Farouk will have the figures about how many times they have invoked the veto, the United States, how many times they've invoked the veto just for Israel, just in favor of Israel, in defiance of the global consensus, in defiance of morality, and in defiance of the principles of the UN Charter. They have specifically and almost exclusively used their veto to violate the principles of the United Nations Charter. If you went down the list, the record of every time the United States has invoked the veto power, I guarantee you that almost every time, if not every time they've done that, they've done it specifically on a matter that violates the principles of the United Nations Charter. And we've seen that especially over the last almost year now with the genocide in Gaza, which is, by any estimation, a genocide by veto. The genocide in Gaza has been empowered and enabled by the U.S. veto power. They've vetoed more ceasefire proposals, ceasefire resolutions than I can even count. And even the one that they did weekly and abstain from voting on and allowed to pass, they prevented it from ever being implemented, even though it was a binding resolution. There's no question legally about whether or not that was a binding resolution. But they've done everything that they could to make sure that it was never implemented. So the veto power is a massive problem because it continuously, it has turned the United Nations into nothing more than just a chamber in which all of the countries of the world come to impotently express their view and impotently go through the exercise of reaching a global consensus on this or that issue, only to then be overruled by the United States. So they've turned, because of the veto power and their abuse of the veto power, they've turned the United Nations into nothing more than a mechanism and an instrument and a vehicle and a platform for showcasing American hegemony over the whole planet. Because they have it in such a way, they've arranged things in such a way, and they dominate the United Nations in such a way that they get to overrule the entire planet, the entire global consensus. 192 other countries, whatever they say is has no force. It's completely irrelevant. And in other words, they're only calling you to give your opinion. They're only calling all of the nations of the world into the General Assembly. They're only calling you to come there to give your opinion, to express your view, to say what you think policy should be, to say how you think this or that conflict should be resolved or this or that issue should be addressed. We're only calling you in there to say that so that we can overrule you and humiliate you and remind you of how little power you have. That's the problem with the veto.
That is actually spot on. The fact that, they do call 190 odd member states in there. And like you say, it's actually just to show that you actually do not have a say, regardless if you think you are making a noise or whatever. It does not matter what they say. When it comes to the veto power, or America's use of the veto power, in the last 3 years, they've used their veto 14 times, 4 times. And of that 14 times, they've used it for Israel 12 of those 14 times, which is a large amount. And especially when you consider that the other members, the other four permanent members also have veto power. France and UK last used their veto in the 1980s. Russia, as far as I know, last used it when they were the USSR. So America is definitely abusing that power.
Sister Nisa.
Yes, Brother Shay, please.
I just want to ask you,
Yes.
when you were talking about the veto, the number of times that the U.S. has used the veto, according to the numbers, it appears that they have accelerated in their use of the veto over the last decade or so. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so think about that. I want everyone in the audience, everyone who's listening, to think about that. What does that indicate? The fact that the United States has used their veto power more frequently recently than in the past. That should let you know how out of step the United States is with the rest of the world. That shows that over the last few years, the world is moving farther and farther away from the United States, and they are growing in their confidence to contradict what the United States wants, to where the United States has had to use the veto power to overrule the world. That shows you, that's an indication that all of the countries in the world are getting fed up. The countries of the world are getting fed up with America using the United Nations as nothing but a tool for internationalizing American policy for American interests and overruling the rest of the planet. The rest of the world is getting fed up. That's why America has had to use the veto more frequently, more often than they have had to use it in the past, and why year after year you're seeing their misuse and their abuse of the veto power increasing year by year. They're having to do it more and more because they're losing control of the rest of the countries on the planet. The global south is rising. The power dynamics in the world are changing. And the United States is moving closer and closer to accountability. The rest of the world wants to hold America accountable. The rest of the world, believe me, the rest of the world, the rest of the countries that are member states of the United Nations and who are in the General Assembly, whether they're on the Security Council or not, whether they're permanent or temporary members or not, if they're a member of the United Nations, you can see by the fact that the United States has intensified in their use of the veto power, that they are increasingly out of step with the rest of the planet, that they're increasingly out of step with the rest of the world, and that the rest of the world doesn't want to take it anymore. The rest of the world wants accountability. So there will be support at the United Nations. This is an indication that there will be absolutely support at the United Nations for the invocation of Article 6. I just wanted to point that out.
Live in the United States, retired from AT&T. My question is, because I'm tired of staying silent and protesting and boycotting, I want to take action. What can I do to take action to make a difference, like an actual progress forward, not just spinning the wheels?
To take action is a very natural emotional response, but you have to filter that emotional response, that moral emotional response from your heart through your head. You have to filter that, you have to channel it through your mind and your rationality and your reason, because that's what our enemies do. Our enemies don't act passionately, they don't act emotionally, and if we act emotionally, then we just become pawns for them to move this way and that, and we become completely susceptible to their propaganda, because the propaganda usually plays on our emotions. So you have to understand that when you talk about taking action, it doesn't necessarily have to mean something dramatic, something even necessarily emotionally satisfying. Sometimes the most effective action is emotionally dissatisfying, but it's effective, but it has an impact. And if you follow a rational, reasonable, intelligent approach, you can achieve more than you ever dreamed that you could achieve. If you take a strategic approach, if you take an emotional approach, believe me, you won't achieve anything except what they want you to achieve, which is always going to be for their benefit. But for example, if you support the Article 6 campaign and you spread the Article 6 campaign among people in the United States and people from your own community who, in my opinion, have as much at stake, American citizens, particularly so-called minority communities in the United States, which are nothing but actually members of the global majority who just happen to live in the United States, but so-called minority communities have as much at stake in the expulsion of the United States from the UN as the communities that there are a diaspora of, communities all around the world, in the global south and so forth. You have as much at stake in the United States as they have around the world. So if you support the expulsion of the United States from the UN, just think, just cast your mind ahead to what could potentially happen with the United States if it was expelled from the UN and the United Nations was liberated from American domination, and it was able to actually hold America accountable for its crimes, that it was actually able to hold America accountable for its endless violations of international law. And if it was actually able, if the United Nations was liberated from American domination and it was actually able to treat America as not an unaccountable state with impunity, as not the master of the world, but as just another nation among the nations of earth, just another country among the countries of the earth that are subject to international law and are subject to accountability. Why, the United Nations could impose economic sanctions on the United States as a penalty, as a punishment, and as a rehabilitative measure to set America straight, to hold America accountable. Economic sanctions on the United States by its major trading partners and by the other 192 countries in the world would be absolutely devastating to the United States. And what could be a more effective and a more potent form of punishment than economic sanctions for a country and for a system that prioritizes profit above people anyway, that prioritizes profit above everything else? If economic sanctions were imposed upon the United States, think about it. The United States runs a trade deficit every year of at least $1 trillion every year. Trade deficit means they import $1 trillion more worth of goods than they export. So what if they couldn't import those goods anymore? $1 trillion worth of goods. And if their exports were also sanctioned. International trade is a massive part of the American GDP. There would be a massive economic contraction in the United States. Major corporations would break down. Their profits would plummet. Wall Street would plummet. The value of the dollar would plummet. The impact of this measure, you can't even fathom, you can't even imagine how powerful it would be for the United States to be expelled from the UN and to then be held accountable by the United Nations. This is actually, in my opinion, this is the most effective measure that we have for literally cutting the tyranny off, cutting the empire off at the knees. So if you want to take an action, as I said, it may not feel satisfying. It may not be emotionally satisfying, for example, to just click a link and sign a petition. It may feel like you're not doing anything. But this is a means to an end, and it's a part of a journey. It's a part of a long-term solution to this problem that has been plaguing the entire planet for decades and decades and decades, if not centuries. So I would encourage you to sign the petition and to share it with your friends and family, and to share it with your community, and to share it with fellow activists, because this truly is a very practical and effective measure for addressing the injustice that we've all been living with for all of our lives and all of our parents' lives and all of our grandparents' lives, and for as long as anyone can remember.
I have a question as well. Look, it has become quite clear who the aggressor is here. You know, the West and the US, they thrive on economic exploitation and debt, right? And they do this through the Western-dominated institutions such as the IMF and World Bank and so on, which I believe are inherently violent systems, you know. And for example, I'm in South Africa, I'm a South African. When we took Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice, and we were the biggest, we still are the biggest sort of like advocates, you know, for human rights and just the atrocities that are being committed in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. And immediately when we took Israel to court, they threatened to impose sanctions on us. You know, we have quite a number of like bilateral trade agreements with the US, and one of those is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is called AGOA, which basically qualifies sub-Saharan African countries to trade with the US and so on. They immediately threatened to remove those and to remove these countries, and especially South Africa, because South Africa was the biggest proponent of, human rights and just for in defense of Palestine. So my question, especially to Brother Shahid, because I know he's been quite vocal on a lot of these issues, to say, that's another thing, that's another like instrument of power and oppression that the West uses upon a lot of these countries. So my question is,
what can the global South and a lot of these sub-Saharan African countries, including South Africa, do to liberate themselves from the clutches of these, institutions such as the IMF and so on? Because these are systems of control. It basically means that you don't have a voice. You're not in a position to criticize America on a lot of their brutalities, because then you risk losing a lot. And this is a question of deep concern for me, because I think the time has come for action on our part. And so it's just a matter of mobilizing these countries to speak in a unified voice. But practically speaking, what can we do to fast track this progress? Thank you.
Sure, it's a great question. I would say one thing. America didn't impose sanctions against South Africa, did they?
No, they did not.
They did not.
Yes.
That's telling. They wouldn't have hesitated to do it in the past. So I think the first thing that we have to do in terms of addressing this threat is making a proper risk assessment and understanding that the threats that the United States makes today don't carry the same weight that they carried 30 years ago. They don't have the same clout that they had 30 years ago. And they don't have the same even independence that they had 30 years ago. And even the power dynamics have shifted to in such a way that the people who have the most power and the entities that have the most power and the institutions that have the most power have also changed with the rise of the corporate sector, with the rise of corporate power, globalization, globalized owners and controllers of capital. This is a phenomenon that has been growing and developing over the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades, and that has created a tremendous shift. And to a certain extent, it has decreased the ability of the United States to impose sanctions effectively against any country. Look at almost any country that has recently had sanctions imposed against them recently. Not like Cuba, even though Cuba has survived fairly well, and not even like Venezuela. But anyway, the Western Hemisphere is a different issue, and Brother Farouk could probably talk more about that. The domination and the control and the brutality of the United States with regards to the hemisphere that it's in is unparalleled around the rest of the world. But look at what was the effect of the sanctions against Russia. Russia is doing better now than they were doing before the sanctions. What about the sanctions against China? China's doing better than they were doing before the sanctions. What about even the sanctions against Iran? Iran is doing fine. America doesn't have the power that they used to have to threaten people with sanctions anymore, to the extent that even the threat itself becomes hollow. They tell South Africa, we're going to do thus and so if you do this and that, and then South Africa does this and that, and America is mute. They've got nothing to say. They have nothing to do. Because they can't afford it, because they know that South Africa has options. South Africa has options now that they didn't have 30 years ago. You have the options of coordinating with BRICS and intra-South trade, intra-South economic cooperation, cooperation even just within the continent of Africa. You have now the option of Chinese investment. You have the option of Chinese funding and financial assistance that you didn't have before, and that doesn't carry the same kind of conditions and the same kind of surrender of sovereignty that comes with IMF so-called aid. And IMF aid, as you correctly said, is not aid. It's a purchase. When the IMF gives you money, they're purchasing the sovereignty of your country. That's not the case with Chinese aid. That's not the case even with Russian aid and cooperation and coordination and trade and so forth between the BRICS nations and even with the GCC. The GCC is now one of the biggest investors in Africa. The UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so forth, they're among the biggest investors, and they have a massive, almost a bottomless pit of capital that they can pull from. So, alhamdulillah, we're in a situation now in the world where the global south countries have options that they never had before. It used to be, the last time we had options was during the Cold War, was during the Soviet Union. That was the last time we had any options in the global south, where you could either be a client of the United States or you could be a client of the Soviet Union. Well, today you don't have to be anybody's client. Alhamdulillah, because we have more options. It's not the Soviet Union, it's not bipolar. Now it's multipolar. People keep talking about the development of multipolarity and whether or not there can be a multipolar world. Well, I have news for you. We're already in a multipolar world. If you look at the evidence, the multipolar world already exists. And this is again why I said earlier about the increasing frequency of America invoking the veto power at the United Nations, because they're losing control. And the reason they're losing control is because no one was ever following them because they agreed with them. They were following them because they had no options. And the moment the countries of the world have options, well, they take those options. And they're not as easily threatened by the United States anymore. As I said, if America were to be sanctioned by the United Nations, America would suffer more than any country that America threatens with sanctions. America would suffer more if they were themselves sanctioned than any country that America sanctions. And America knows that. So the first part of, with regards to your question, is to make a proper and accurate risk assessment. That when the United States says we're going to impose sanctions on you, no, you won't. No, you won't. Because you know that we've got investors lined up from China, we've got investors lined up from Russia. And you're in a battle now. America is in a battle now for influence in Africa. So how are you going to take yourself out of the game by sanctioning South Africa? You take yourself out of the game, and we'll just go to someone else. The same thing with Saudi Arabia, for example. The United States is trying to put pressure for this so-called normalization with Israel, and using as what they think is their leverage to say, well, we won't sell you weapons to MBS. We won't sell you the weapons. And he's saying, well, I'm your biggest weapons purchaser, and I could just purchase them from somewhere else. I could purchase them from Turkey. I could purchase them from China. I could purchase them from Russia. Not to mention I'm building my own weapons sector in my own country that's going to make us independent with regards to the manufacture and the procurement of advanced technology, weapons technology. Nobody needs you. Nobody needs you anymore. So I think that this is the first steps to understand how real the threat is on the part of America, because most of the time they're bluffing. These days they're bluffing. It wasn't the case 30 years ago. They could throw their weight around. When the Soviet Union fell and it was a unipolar world and America was the so-called world's only remaining superpower, that was those days. I remember those days. But now, alhamdulillah, I've lived long enough to see that we don't live in those days anymore. Now it is a multipolar world, and the countries of the global south don't have to choose America's way or the highway. They have their options. They have other options that they can ally with, and other sources of funding, other sources of investment, other sources of aid, other sources of capital, and so forth. So I would just say that the other step there is to just increase the coordination and the cooperation with the BRICS nations, and to see the BRICS organization grow. Although I think they've put a temporary freeze on allowing in new members while they develop their protocols. But either way, BRICS is only set to increase. There's more than 100 countries that are interested in joining BRICS. And right now, if you look at the situation with BRICS, it's astonishing. The Suez Canal is under BRICS. The Red Sea is under BRICS. The Strait of Hormuz is under BRICS. And soon, inshallah, the Strait of Malacca will be under BRICS. The most important trade routes in the world are in the hand of BRICS. America is losing its ability to threaten anybody economically anymore. Jazakallah khair.
As a matter of fact, as we speak, there's a lot of talk in the Cape now to break away from the rest of South Africa and become an independent state altogether.
I would be very cautious about any movement and any call for the breaking up of any country in the global south, particularly any BRICS country. If any sort of secessionist, independence type movements are formed, whether it's in South Africa or anywhere else, I would be extremely suspicious of those types of movements, and I would think that would be something that's being instigated by the United States themselves. So I would be very cautious about something like that.
It is. It is, because the party or the guy that's trying to do it is directly from Britain. He's a British citizen that moved here about 20 years ago. That's calling for this.
There you go. This shows you this is what they have left. Because I'll tell you what they did in South Africa. You know better than me, of course, but as an outsider, I'll tell you, as an outsider and as an American who's familiar with what America does, familiar with America's policies around the world, I can tell you from that perspective. Obviously, as a South African, you know better than me what's going on inside your own country. But how it looks to me, they made the case at the ICJ. America said, we're going to sanction you. Then they realize between themselves, Americans, well, we can't sanction them. Obviously, that's a hollow threat. We can't do that. That's against our own interests. So what did they do instead? They infiltrated the government with the DA. They infiltrated the government with the so-called Democratic Alliance, which is nothing but a demonic alliance. They put them in the government so that they could try to continue to have a neoliberal grip on South Africa, because they could feel that they were losing control of South Africa. So then, now what you're talking about, which is news to me, that there's some kind of a fledgling movement for independence or separation for the Cape of Good Hope. This is their next step. This is their next move to try to balkanize South Africa, if they can do it, and weaken South Africa, which ultimately that would be weakening for South Africa. So this is what they do. So this shows you, when you see the moves that they're making, you realize the moves that they can't make. The moves that they can't make, that they threaten you that they're going to make, you know already they don't have the power to do that. All they have the power to do now is through tampering with elections, interfering with elections, and regime change maneuvers. Regime change maneuvers and supporting separatist movements to try to subvert acts of subversion, subversive movements and organizations through NGOs and through CIA assets that they plant in your country. This is what they do, and that's still a power that they have, and that's very real. And we just saw it happen in Bangladesh with the removal of Sheikh Hasina, and that's not to endorse Sheikh Hasina, but it's to say it's very plainly a regime change that was engineered by the United States. I don't want to move off of the Article 6 issue, but all of what I've just said, all of what I just talked about, all of the actions that the United States takes, and that has the same kind of actions that they have always taken, all of these are reasons why they need to be expelled from the United Nations so that they can be held accountable.
The UN petition, what I've learned from you all is that it protects us as United States citizens because of the number of people that have been unalived due to weapons held by a law enforcer. What is it, 1,700, I believe you said, Shahid, was just in the past year.
Over
1,200 to gun violence. But more than that is our government, we have to start taking the reins back and the power back and protecting ourselves. Part of that is if our government is lying to us about federal withholding, it's unconstitutional. Thomas Massey tweeted this February 2024 saying, when are we going to repeal this? It's unconstitutional. American workers deserve to have their money back. But it's not, because they have gotten so used to taking the money from you and then using it to benefit themselves. They're making a profit on our work, on our labor. We're giving up 1 to 2 hours a day, depending on how much, up to 40% of your paycheck is taxed. And that's federal withholding. That is money that you can stop today legally. Stop funding the government. But again, the bigger reason is we have to start protecting ourselves. But after watching things like the DNC and realizing how many people, do you see how much production it takes to keep a lie going? All of that, everything they sold to those people was production to keep them asleep. And I think we have to keep breaking through that illusion for people and showing them the truth. And the bigger part of that is if there are 340 million of us Americans, we can take that money back, that power back, to beat a system like APAC system, to beat this whole thing. But we have to unite and do it ourselves. And part of that, or the bigger portion of that, is understanding that this petition, invoking the sixth, protects us as citizens. So I wanted just to add that, because somebody commented about usury. That's exactly what they are doing with every single American here. You go to work every day, you're barely making it yourself, and they're taking the money that they're taking from you, calling it foreign aid, and then sending it directly to weapons manufacturing. Part of this was 2 months ago. What's her name? Pelosi. She made $10 million in 1 month profit off weapons manufacturing from American workers, taxpayer, tax wages that are being sent directly to weapons manufacturing. So I just have tried to combine with Haya on this, and I go on her lives to try to teach people this, because it's all connected, and we have to keep supporting one another in the whole process, because it's a lot of unlearning that's having to be done, and a lot of waking up to the realities of our lack of protections here in the United States, and realize that they don't care. They don't care enough to tell people that, you're struggling to buy groceries. But just in my example alone, when I realized this, I stopped I exempted myself, and I filed the correct paperwork so that I'm legally protected. So that's it. I just wanted to add that, because part of this awakening includes understanding that this government does not care about the average American citizen. They just don't. We are not part of the equation.
The American people absolutely have a lot, as I've been saying, they have a lot at stake here, and they have as much at stake as anyone else would have at stake around the world with regards to expelling the United States from the United Nations, because the same way that America violates international law all around the world, well, I have news for you. They violate international law against you, against the American people. They don't want American people to even think about international law, to where they don't even know what their rights are under international law. I mean, just you were talking about the what amounts to extrajudicial killings by the security forces. As I've said many times, that's what we would call it if it was happening in any other country. In America, they just refer to it dismissively as a police shooting, a wrongful death, police brutality at the max is what they'll call it. But let's call it what it is. This is extrajudicial killing by the security forces. Over 1,200 American citizens murdered just last year by your own security forces. That's just by the police. Forget about just gun violence, which was over 43,000 people murdered. 43,000 people murdered last year. At least a quarter of those were children. These are casualty figures that you only get from a war zone. These aren't casualty figures that you get from a country that's at peace, but they've normalized it for you. The propaganda and the indoctrination, everything that you just said, that people have to, there's all of this unlearning that has to be done. Well, that's because you've been fed this belief, that this indoctrination and this propaganda, to where you believe in the so-called American dream, and it turns out that the American dream is actually just a drunken stupor. It's a drunken stupor, where you've been drunk on propaganda and indoctrination, and on top of that, you're punch drunk from the relentless beating that system has been giving you your whole life. And the only one that you are supposed to believe that you can go to for redress of your grievances are the very ones who are committing the crimes against you. This is the way they've got the system. They've got you locked. They've got you locked in to where you're cut off from, especially, like I said, so-called minority communities, which are actually just members of the global majority who happen to live in the United States. They've got you cut off from the global majority. Because if you thought of yourself as part of the global majority, then you might think about the fact that you have recourse to international law. If you think of yourself as actually a member of the global community, then you would think about the fact that you have access to international law. And the main body for the enforcement of international law is the United Nations. So you should be able, when the police or the security forces are targeting your community, and as we know, they are targeting so-called minority communities because they're acting the same way. It's just a domestic colonizing police force. It's a domestic colonizing security force doing the same thing that they do in the countries that they colonize, to the same types of people, to the black and brown people, to the Muslim people, to the non-white people, non-white, non-Christian people, and to people of a certain economic strata. This is systematic, and it's systemic. And according to international law, you could make the argument, you could make a strong argument that this is a form of ethnic cleansing, because they're targeting these communities for extrajudicial killing, and they're targeting these communities for feeding them into the mass incarceration prison industrial complex / ethnic cleansing machine of the United States, that then puts these people in prison, sometimes for their entire life, where they're forced to work for free, essentially slave labor, virtually slave labor in every practical sense. It's slave labor, where they have to work for the profit of private enterprise. And people don't know that there's something they can do about that. They don't know that that's against international law. They think that the only thing they can do is protest about it. They think the only thing they can do is write to their congressman or write to their senator or what have you. But you have recourse to international law. But the problem is that even if you were to take a case to the United Nations, well, your country would overrule it immediately. So the only way that you can get the United Nations to actually help you in the United States against the crimes, the violations of international law that are committed against you, the only way that can happen is if America gets expelled from the United Nations, so the United Nations can actually hold America accountable for the crimes that they commit abroad and for the crimes that they commit against their own population.
Brother Shahid, I just wanted to add one last thing to that. I think about this a lot, and I've been sharing this with as many independent media, like podcasters, media, that I can find. I've sent them comments. I've shared. Haya and I created a Telegram channel where I wrote just a paragraph and asked everybody that follows her to share this little paragraph saying, they heard about this and they want to know how they can, or let's bring attention to it. We want this shared publicly so people know, like, we have to get out of this bubble. But when you were talking about law enforcement, 3 months ago, my son, he's 28, but we're Mexican American. I have 2 boys, but he was beaten almost to death by 6 police officers for something they said. They thought that he had a weapon in a backpack. He was the wrong person, but it took somebody walking by who was filming it to say, "You're going to kill him, get off his neck." But what my point to that is, these officers were trained in Israel. They were trained by IOF, whatever they do there. But that's where their training came from. And my other point to that is, this has to be shared with the communities like in Atlanta, where they're protesting Cobb City, because all of this applies to everybody. This is not just about what is going on in Gaza. This is here, and this is now, and we are becoming more and more policed, monitored. It's getting worse, and it's time for us, the people, to start fighting amongst each other and unite, because
absolutely,
we have to save ourselves. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Absolutely.
For sharing all of this and for educating us.
Thank you.
You have provided the education for me. I listen to you every time I can find you live and on YouTube, but because I really didn't understand that this protects us in the U.S. as well. We need the protection. We're under a rogue government that is getting more and more militarized.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, and I'm terribly, terribly sorry to hear about what happened to your son. It reminds me, anyone who has gone through an experience like that, or knows anyone who's gone through an experience like that, or has even heard about those stories, it's always the same, isn't it? The police say, "Well, we thought he had a gun." That's what they always say. And there's no difference between that. When you hear that, it's the same thing as when Israel says there's a Hamas headquarters under Al-Shifa Hospital. It's the same thing. When they say that Hamas is using a school for terrorist activity or what have you, that there's so-called terrorists or resistance fighters inside of a school or inside of a refugee camp or inside of a clinic, inside of a hospital, that's exactly the same thing as when the police say, oh, we thought he had a gun, and that's why we shot him. That's why we killed this innocent person, because we thought he had a gun. And that's where you see a direct connection between those officers, so-called officers, security forces, being trained by those same people who make those same excuses when they murder innocent people.